now to talking about vulnerability, and as we saw earlier, the first stage of an adaptation process generally involves assessing risks and potential impacts of climate change that then inform how you think about what your responses might be. Often, and especially in Africa, these risks and impacts are explored through a vulnerability framework. Vulnerability itself has its roots in the hazard and disaster risk reduction response world, but it's taken on its own specific definitions in the climate change context. And again, we can go back to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to come up with a commonly used definition of vulnerability, which is defined as the propensity or the predisposition to be adversely affected by a climate or weather event. Vulnerability often is thought of in terms of three different components. The first, exposure to a hazardous climate phenomenon. Secondly, the sensitivity or susceptibility to harm from that hazard. And then thirdly, the capacity to cope and adapt to that exposure and risk. So if we look at exposure in a bit more detail, what we're really talking about here is what are the climate risks in a particular setting that people are exposed to. So let's compare, for instance, Madagascar to Namibia. In Madagascar, the communities there are exposed regularly to tropical cyclones because Madagascar lies in the typical pathway of Indian Ocean hurricanes. In Namibia, there's never a hurricane that hits Namibia, so they're not exposed to that particular hazard. But there's much greater risk of drought in Namibia because it's a semi-arid and arid country, and so the exposure there is, one of the key exposures is drought risk, which is much higher than in Madagascar, although Madagascar does also have drought risk, but it wouldn't be the number one exposure that one was thinking about in that context. If we look at sensitivity, then we need to be thinking about, for that given climate risk, whether it's a hurricane or a drought, how severe is the impact of that particular risk going to be in that particular context for those individuals and communities and societies. So an example of this, one could think of a farmer who is exposed to drought. And you might have two farmers next door to each other. One of them has built a dam that allows him or her to store water for the drought years, and the other one doesn't have a dam. The drought hits, one farmer has water available to support his or her agriculture, the other doesn't. So one is much more sensitive to that drought than the other. The sensitivity to exactly the same climate event is different across those two different farmers. And finally, we need to talk about adaptive capacity, the third pillar of vulnerability. And this is the ability of a person or a community or a country to respond to existing climate risks, to changing risks, and to new and future risks. There are many dimensions to adaptive capacity. One of the ways that people talk about adaptive capacity or help to frame it is in terms of what is termed capitals. And there are a number of different types of capital that would define how strong the adaptive capacity of a society or a community actually is. The first capital that people talk about is human capital. And this is around the knowledge that people have, the skills that they have, the energy they have, the agency that they have, and even the health that they have to be able to respond to a climate risk and start the adaptation process. The second capital is social capital, and this is rather than an individual's capabilities, it's around the ability of groups to work together, to share knowledge and to make decisions, so collectively to move forward with adaptation. Natural capital refers to the natural resources, the environmental resources that can be drawn on in responding to climate change. So for example, if an emerging risk is drought, if there's a natural capital in terms of water, groundwater for instance, being available, then an adaptation response might be to draw on that natural capital by putting in a borehole, and that makes water available to see you through the drought years. But if groundwater isn't available, one would have to then say, well, that natural capital is not there to support that particular type of adaptation. A really important type of capital in many situations is what people call financial capital. And this essentially is around the monetary resources one needs to implement and go through an adaptation process. This can be existing assets that you might have, so your savings in your bank as an individual, or for a municipality, essentially its budgetary capability, but also access to finance such as credit, insurance, and maybe even grants from funds such as the Green Climate Fund. Those are critical capitals that are needed if one is going to have the capacity to respond to climate change. And then the final capital is physical capital, and this is around talks to the sort of infrastructure and other physical assets that need to be in place to support the adaptation process. So that might be telecommunications, it might be existing water resource infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure, hospitals, etc. If that capital, that infrastructure capital is already there, then it makes it much easier to respond to additional climate risks. So in many parts of Africa, sensitivity is often high and the adaptive capacity is low. And if we look at these capitals of adaptive capacity, we can see that they're pretty strongly correlated with social and economic development metrics. So the capitals that we're talking about in terms of adaptive capacity, one can link very directly to the capitals that emerge when you have good development outcomes. So where adaptive capacity is low, it's very likely that the levels of human development are low across those multiple dimensions.